Welcome to Tanakh Talk Live, coming to you live from Kingsland, Texas, USA. I'm your host, William Hall, bringing to you another fine episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Almost threw a middle letter in there. I don't even know what it is. He's coming to you out of, Rabbi, where are you at right now?
New Jersey.
New Jersey. We got you in the States. It sure would have been kind of neat to actually have you pop into this little tiny hodunk town of Kingsland, Texas. That would have been quite interesting. Okay, let me do this real fast. I'm going to pull up you here. Desktop presenter. Nope. I like this song. It's really nice. And I found out that this song is not copyrighted, so we won't have any issues there. And it was actually produced by the Israeli Defense Forces, specifically for non-copyright purposes, so that people can use that. And that little jewel comes to you from Rabbi Tobias Singer, because we were running into issues with the songs we were choosing. And so there's Rabbi Skobac. Wow, you look great. The lights, the camera, the action. How are you tonight, sir? Let me get
Thank God, doing well.
That's really, really great. That's really great. Well, I'll tell you what. Once again, it's good to see you. I see you up close and personal. I've got you on the big screen in front of me now. So it looks like you and I feel like I am sitting in the room with you right now. Hopefully everyone else will have that up close and personal feel to it as well. So I think we've got all the volumes set. I think everything is cued the way it needs to. All I need to do now is pause this music so it doesn't play quietly in the background. I'm going to downsize it, get it out of the way. And Rabbi, I think that we are just about ready to go. David, are you ready?
Yep.
Are you sure you're ready?
Yep.
Okay, David's ready. That means we must continue. All right, Rabbi, episode number 8, Matthew chapter 6.
Matthew chapter 5.
Oh, man, I knew it. I was looking on my, when I created this whole thing, I said Matthew chapter 6, ... or 5. I'm like, man, I don't know where we're at. I could see it in front of me, but my memory is about 5 seconds long. I mean, I think most people know that by now. So let me
use some ginkgo biloba.
Right now, I could use some Java de Juan Valdez, I think. Okay, I kind of moved my computer out of the way a little bit. So you people up there, if you see me looking this way, I'm looking at my Bible screen that I'm pulling up so I can follow our genius Rabbi along. And there it comes. Wow. Rabbi, what a busy week. I've been, like you saw earlier today on Skype, I've been in bondage to a beautiful view and wonderful temperatures on a job on the lake. And it's just been, it's spoiled me. I'm really not looking forward to driving into all these other areas now in the hot summer sun and dust flying and covered in sweat and crawling under houses and in the roofs. And this, so I'm enjoying this moment. It's been a long week, but it's been a long, good week. I hope yours has been the same with all your travels.
Sometimes when they say by the sweat of your brow you will eat bread, it's not so terrible. Sometimes work can be very pleasant. Yeah, I'm really, really having an awesome Passover with friends and family as well. And I'm just Passover is my favorite holiday.
All right.
I'm very plugged into Passover, and hopefully we'll get a strong dose of it and it'll last us into next year.
Okay, question for you. This is just a fun question for me. Isn't Passover eating the bread? It's supposed to be like the bread of affliction, but I really haven't been experiencing that. My wife is and my son came to me today with lunch, and you know what he brought me, Rabbi? He brought me the most delicious matzah peanut butter and jelly sandwich I've ever had.
Sounds pretty awesome.
But it wasn't really the affliction. There was no affliction there.
Well, it's interesting because it was the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate. Them, it was a bread of affliction. But our sages tell us that for us, matzah is really the bread of faith. And it's a bread which actually has the ability to strengthen our faith, because matzah really connects us with the core of Passover, which is the moment in history, world history, when a people became electrically aware of God's presence. One of the things that the Bible focuses on so much is the Exodus story, because it's really sort of Grand Central Station for the time in history when we became so clearly aware of the fact that there was a God that runs the world. So for us, it's not really so much a bread of affliction. I know that some people have a hard time digesting it. Maybe for them it's a bread of affliction, but the sages say it's a bread of faith, and it really helps build faith. And that's really what is so, for me, delicious about Passover. It's that it's a holiday which is so focused on God and the reality of God and seeing God clearly and experiencing God, and it's so removed from affliction. I find it to be the most special, spiritual, joyous time really of the year. So keep on eating that matzah and keep building your faith.
That's awesome. And Rabbi, we had a really most excellent Pesach. Also, we were invited by my dear friend Lon Cherry Holmes, who is he is in his final stages of his conversion, and he lives in Dallas, and he goes to a synagogue there. And he invited us up again. We went there last year. It was fantastic. This year was even better. And it was just amazing. It was absolutely amazing. We totally loved it. And just for clarification's sake, I said something before. I was given, I guess you could say, mentioning people who had major changes or major effects in my change from Christianity and Messianic Judaism into where we're at now. And there were really a lot of people who involved. Rabbi Michael Skobac, you were one of them. The thing that I had access to me was I had sent to me through emails. I mean, they eventually, when I got linked up with the right people, they were sending me links from everywhere. And I got yours. I got Rabbi Singer's. I even got hooked up with somewhere down the road, Nativ in Houston. But Lon Cherry Holmes, this guy we went to go see, I've known him for a long time. And since he was, quote unquote, bar mitzvahed, and he's 27 now, I think. And he was bar mitzvahed actually at my dad's Messianic synagogue. That's why I kind of do the quote unquote thing. So he's well aware of this too, and he's converting, like I said. But he brought this information to me in the most strangest way, which is probably normal. But for me, it was different because I was raised in Christianity to where you're supposed to witness to everybody. You go out and, you take, you show them, you teach them, you tell them about Jesus and do this and do that. And even as a Messianic, you kind of did the same thing. And so whenever he came to me, he never really did that with me. In fact, it was a while before I realized he wasn't even part of the movement anymore. He has a very unique case in that he was actually born into Messianic Judaism. He wasn't born into Christianity like so many others. But anyway, just to wrap this up quickly, because we've got to move on. He definitely probably had the most high volume impact on me because he stayed with me through it all. He stayed through with me like step by step, all the way through you, through Rabbi Tovia Singer, through all these other balancing act I was trying to do. And it was really amazing. He was just a gentle soul. He didn't push anything on me. He didn't expect anything from me. He just kind of gave me information as I needed. It was a wonderful thing. Just like you guys,
that's the best kind of brother.
And, that's how we actually view you as well. I mean, people tune in to your shows because they choose to. You're not invading their homes and you're not bashing Christians. And I think that's what really makes it such an effective tool in this whole transition for so many people, is having people like you and people like Lon and Rabbi Singer and stuff to be able to help us through this thing. So I'll be quiet now. Let's move on. Rabbi, thank you so much for all you do. And with that said,
here with you,
Matthew chapter 5.
Yeah, so we got up to verse 21 last week. I don't think we were going to finish the whole chapter. It's a very juicy chapter. And what we were seeing was that, quite a bit of the Sermon on the Mount really doesn't come as any great revelation to traditional, normal Torah-educated Jews, because so much of it really resonates with Judaism and with the Torah. And, we have no problem with that. And then, of course, anything that we find that's inconsistent and that clashes and contradicts the Torah, then we really have to look at it more critically. So in verse 21, we have really a number of passages here where, there's almost a formula where Jesus says that you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, but I say to you. Here he begins in verse 21, you have heard it said to our ancestors, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment, and whoever says to his brother, fool, will be subject to the Sanhedrin, but whoever says you moron will be subject to hellfire. And so I think that in my studies of Christian commentaries, many of them really see these passages as a critique of the Judaism of the Torah, which they see as very focused on externals and the superficial. And they say that Jesus goes beyond the externals, beyond the superficial, and gets to the essence, gets to the core. And you see this sort of really brought out in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, where it says that now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. And you have, I believe, many people who see the Sermon on the Mount as sort of one-upping Torah Judaism, and sort of Jesus really taking it to the next level. I met years ago a Baptist minister, as a pastor, for many years, that was actually in the process of leaving Christianity and converting to Judaism. And he told me that what really prompted him to think about this journey was actually the book of Hebrews. Because he said when he was reading in the book of Hebrews, it speaks about a better high priest and a better covenant and a better, a new covenant, and everything is better and new and improved. And what disturbed him was his conviction that God doesn't make junk. Right. And how could, God's original creations of the priesthood and the temple and the laws of the Torah themselves, to say that now we've got something better, he felt was really inconsistent, because his sense, his intuition was that you can't improve upon what God originally made. You don't see any passage at all in the Hebrew Bible that says that there was something temporary or inferior or problematic with any of the institutions that God originally gave Israel. As a matter of fact, in Psalm 19, verse 7, the psalmist says, Torat Hashem Temima, the Torah of God is perfect. You can't improve on perfection. And when you read Psalm 119, which is the longest chapter in the entire Bible, 176 verses, it's this beautiful, delicious love song, a poem of love about how beautiful and delicious and sweet and precious every drop of the Torah is. So to say that, it took until Matthew 5 to really come to the fullness of Torah, sort of is a repudiation of the idea that the Torah itself is perfect. Now, what you do find in Matthew here, and in Jesus's words, is sort of a going to sort of a secondary level of the teachings of the Torah. So when Jesus says that it's not just murder that's prohibited, but even being angry with your brother, hating your brother, that's true. And so we find in Jewish teachings the very same idea. For example, in Tractate in the Talmud, Baba Metzia, page 58b, Rabbi Eliezer says, anyone who hates his brother belongs to the shedders of blood. And anyone who publicly shames their brother is as though they shed blood. And the Talmud even goes so far as to relegate to Gehenna, to sort of, if you want to loosely speak about hell, anyone who even calls their friend by a derisive, cruel nickname. So it's not just murdering people. It's even embarrassing someone in public. That's considered to be transgression.
Wow.
What I wanted to bring out here is that within the Torah itself, within Judaism itself, a major teaching and component is the idea of what is called lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. See, some people see the New Testament as a critique of Judaism, which was so focused on, being punctilious about just the observance of the letter of the law, but built into the fabric of Judaism and the teachings of our sages is the idea that just following the letter of the law is not where it's at. As a matter of fact, the Talmud in Tractate Baba Metzia says something dramatic. It says on page 30 that Jerusalem was destroyed because the people followed the Torah. And the Talmud catches itself and says, really? What's wrong with following the Torah? That sounds like a good thing.
Right.
So the Talmud says, well, the problem was they were only following the letter of the law. They weren't going beyond the letter of the law. So the Talmud is consistently telling us that going beyond the letter of the law and seeking to fulfill even the spirit of the law is part of the Torah itself. It's not something which is only discovered by Christianity. There's actually in the same tractate in the Talmud, Baba Metzia, page 83a, an amazing story where Rabbi Bar Abchana had some porters that were transporting some barrels of wine for him. And they broke the barrels of wine. And so he took their cloaks as collateral, I guess, as payment for the damages they caused. And they went to see the great scholar at that time who was called Rav. And Rav said to Rabbah, you have to give them back their cloaks. You have to return their cloaks to them. And he said, is that the law? Meaning, is that what the law requires? And so Rav said, yes. And then he quoted Proverbs chapter 2, verse 20, which says, because you have to walk in the way of good. Walk in the way of the good. And so he had to return their cloaks. But then these porters complained, and they said, look, we worked all day long, and, we didn't get paid. So
wow.
Rav said, well, you got to give them their pay. They worked for you. And Rabbi was, a little bit puzzled and said, look, all they did was bust my barrels. They didn't really do anything constructive. Is that the law? The law requires me to pay them? And so Rav said, yes. And then he finished quoting that verse in Proverbs 2, verse 20. And he said, yes, you have to watch the path of the righteous. So this idea of Judaism only being focused on the letter of the law is, just simply not true. And anyone that really studies the teachings of our sages and in the Talmud sees that its entire focus really is to help get us beyond the simple letter of the law, which is really it's a minimum standard, and to realize that we really have to seek to go way beyond that. Now, what I found peculiar about this passage here in Matthew 5 was that one of the things that supposedly Jesus teaches is that if you call your brother Raka, and that's how some Christian Bibles have it, they don't translate it, they just leave it as the Aramaic Raka, which is Aramaic for empty. In Hebrew, rake is empty. So he's saying that if you call your brother Raka, or empty, really empty-headed or an airhead, then you are subject to the Sanhedrin. It's very, very bad. And so here you have, this seemingly reasonable direction, teaching by Jesus. But what is, to me, ironic is that in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says that the scribes and the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, and so therefore he teaches his followers that therefore you have to follow everything that they teach, meaning that because the Pharisees and the scribes sit in the seat of Moses and have the authority of Moses, Jesus says you have to follow everything that they teach.
Can I ask a question on that Moses seat? I've heard that this is I learned this like on the Messianic side, and I'm not discrediting it. I just don't know if it's true or not. They said that the Moses seat was had been extrapolated from the Bema seat, which is the chair in every synagogue where they sit to actually read the Torah. And the explanation was that if he said the scribes and the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, therefore everything they teach you or tell you from that seat, meaning from what they read from the Torah, that you shall do. But then it says, don't do after their actions, because they say it, but they don't actually do it. Is there any truth to that, to the Bema seat thing?
Well, not that I'm aware of. I think that the context is pretty clear in Matthew, that it's not simply saying that when the scribes and the Pharisees read from the Torah, you've got to follow, because why mention scribes and Pharisees? Meaning he could have said the Sadducees as well, who also, and they were the ones that only read from the Torah. Seems pretty clear that,
interesting.
At least to me, that he's accepting the legitimacy of the oral Torah and of the teachings of the sages.
Right.
I don't really see any other way of reading that passage, although when we get to Matthew 23, we'll spend some time analyzing it. But what I wanted to focus is on the part that you read, meaning that, so Jesus says that everything they teach you have to do, but Jesus says in verse 3, but don't look and see what they do. What they teach you should follow, but don't follow after what they do, because Jesus says they don't practice what they preach, meaning what they preach you should follow. But don't try to learn by watching them, because he accuses them of being hypocrites who don't follow what they preach. So what I found strange is that here in Matthew 5, Jesus really curses out anyone who calls someone a fool. And then in Matthew 23, verse 3, he says that the Pharisees were people who didn't practice what they preach. But just a few verses later, in Matthew 23:17, Jesus calls the Pharisees blind fools. So if there's an actual problem with calling someone a fool, Jesus himself would have a problem, at least if we accept the gospel accounts as accurate. In Luke chapter 11, verse 40, he calls the Pharisees fools again. And Paul, we know in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, refers to the Galatians as foolish. So
interesting. So you're saying that that's not what he was telling them in the beginning was, woe to anybody who calls a man a fool,
I have no difficulty believing that he might have taught that.
Gotcha.
I just think that it becomes strange when, right after accusing the Pharisees of being hypocrites who don't practice what they preach, just a few verses later, he breaks really his own teaching. And even though he had taught that you should not call anyone a fool, that's exactly what he calls the Pharisees. So I think that, the thrust of this passage we just read, is certainly, it's in line with Jewish teaching that we should, not just avoid murdering people, we should avoid hurting their feelings in any way, and certainly calling them names, even calling them by a non-complimentary nickname. That's what the Jewish sources, our Talmud, says all of that kind of behavior, anything that we do to hurt someone's feelings, to embarrass them, is totally against the teachings of Judaism. So moving on to verse 23,
okay.
It says that if you are offering your gift on the altar, and then you remember that your brother has something against you, meaning you have some kind of a grudge or a conflict that wasn't resolved, so Jesus says you should leave your gift in front of the altar, etc., and be reconciled with your brother. What I wanted to focus on was the reality here that Jesus speaks about bringing offerings to the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the altar in the temple. And what's interesting is that you don't see Jesus here, or really anywhere, hinting
Yep.
that the temple and the sacrifices are going to be replaced. Now, you do find passages where he predicts the temple is going to be destroyed, which you didn't really need to be a rocket scientist to predict if those words were actually spoken by him. I mean, the gospel writers that write them were writing after the temple was destroyed.
Right, which would have been very easy for them to fabricate this thing, making it look like that they knew.
Even if it was written before, you know, it was so clear that there was a tinderbox at the time, and the Romans were about just to let hell break loose. And so it wasn't really any great shock when in the year 70 they destroyed the temple. But what you don't find is any indication that the system that God instituted of having a temple and having sacrifices was going to be replaced with the belief or faith in the Messiah. And what's interesting is that even after the death of Jesus, you see that his apostles, his disciples, were going to the temple and they were bringing sacrifices. And there's an interesting passage in the book of Acts where the disciples in Jerusalem, they seem to always have this conflict with Paul. And they heard there were rumors about Paul, who was teaching people not to follow the Torah. They wanted Paul to prove that he really was faithful to the Torah. And so they devised a test for Paul. And in Acts chapter 21, verses 23 to 24, they say to Paul, look, there were these men that had taken an oath. They had become Nazarites, which means for a certain period of time they were not drinking wine, they were not coming in contact with the dead, they were not cutting their hair. And we know that in the Bible, we see in Numbers chapter 6, that after they finished their oath, the period of time when they were going to be a Nazarite, they had to then cut their hair, and they would bring sacrifices to the temple, including one of the sacrifices was a sin offering, a sin sacrifice. So it's interesting that even the followers of Jesus did not believe that the sin sacrifices had been replaced and were done away with. It may have been something that they had heard about Paul's teachings, possibly, that, you know, Paul was teaching that now that Jesus died for their sins, there's no more sacrifices. And it could be that that's one of the reasons why they wanted Paul to specifically do that activity. They could have asked him to perform any commandment in the Torah. Why specifically sponsor the offerings of the Nazarites? So that's a suggestion that was made by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Blumenthal, that, you know, the disciples of Jesus in Jerusalem had not accepted this idea that Jesus replaced the sacrificial system and that believing in him was all that it took. Now in verse 27, Jesus says, you've heard, I just want to repeat, I don't know if Jesus said this, these are words that at least people are claiming Jesus said. You've heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery in his heart. I remember that former President Jimmy Carter was famous for speaking about lusting in his heart. This is a totally surprising teaching for educated Jews, because the rabbis basically taught the exact same thing. I'll just give you several examples. In Leviticus Rabbah, which is the Midrash to the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, passage 12, so the rabbis quote a verse in the book of Job, chapter 24, verse 15, which says, the eye of the adulterer waits for the twilight, saying, no eye shall see me. So in the Midrash, Reish Lakish expounded, you must not suppose that only he who has committed the crime with his body is called an adulterer, because if he commits adultery with his eyes, he is also called an adulterer, for it says the eye of the adulterer. And then in another tractate in the Talmud, Masechet Kala, chapter 1, the rabbis teach, he who looks at a woman with desire is as one who had illicit intercourse with her. Again, it's not saying that he's actually committed adultery and he could be, you know, executed by the Beit Din for committing adultery, but it's saying that it has sort of that impact that it's not considered to be neutral activity. It's really looked down upon as really sinful. And then actually the rabbis go way beyond this in Numbers Rabbah, the Midrash to the book of Numbers, 8:5, and they say actually when a man has the intention to sin, it is as though he has already sinned against God, even though he hadn't actually done it. So this teaching in the Sermon on the Mount here is what you could say pretty consistent with Jewish teaching. In verse 29, it's taught, here's where it gets a little bit dicey. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. What I find interesting here, I mean, these are pretty tough standards to meet. Obviously, many commentaries will insist that the language is hyperbolic, it's hyperbole, it was not meant to be taken literally. But it's interesting that at least in the spirit of what's being said, there's a very strict standard that's being described here. And at the same time, either Jesus or the gospel writers excoriate the sages, the Pharisaic sages, for imposing what they thought were stringent extra-legal burdens on the people. And here in the Sermon on the Mount, you certainly have a standard of living that's quite high, that's imposed upon people. And it's very hard, actually, to say that it's totally hyperbole here. And it's just meant to force and compel people to recognize that they really can't do any of this. And it's just to force them to realize the need for grace. That's what many commentaries say. Because later we're going to see in Matthew chapter 7, towards verses 21 to 27, Jesus seems to say that, no, you actually have to live according to these teachings in this sermon. It's not just meant as window dressing. It's not meant, to make a cute point. He actually seems to demand that people actually follow these teachings. What you had, interestingly, was Eusebius, who was one of the early church fathers, wrote that Origen, another early, I think in the 2nd century, that Origen, one of the early church fathers, actually took this passage and also Matthew 19:12 quite literally, and he castrated himself.
Wow.
Now, some people dispute whether this is true, but it's actually mentioned in many early Christian sources. So at least there were some people who took these teachings literally. And just one more point about this little passage is, something that comes up repeatedly in the Christian scriptures, the idea of going to hell and being thrown into hell. And we see that in the New Testament, this idea of burning in hell, it's certainly a phrase that comes up a lot in Christian thought and just in speech. It's very different than the concept in Judaism. In Christianity, basically, you have this idea of eternal damnation, which is really eternal punishment. That, people who are sinners, which really everyone is according to the New Testament. So anyone who is a sinner that doesn't come to faith in Jesus basically is seen as someone who will perish and burn in hell forever. There's really no such concept in traditional Jewish thought. An idea that, after people die, if they're not deemed perfectly righteous, they will face an eternity of burning and being punished in hell. In Judaism, it's not really seen so much as eternal punishment, rather a limited time that's for the purpose of correcting us and purifying us and improving us so that we can then move on to really spend our eternity in bliss, in relationship with God. So without getting into a long discussion now about heaven and hell, but basically the idea in the New Testament seems to be hell is the state of eternal suffering and eternal punishment. And in Jewish thought, it's really not seen as a state of eternal punishment and eternal damnation, but actually a great kindness that God does to us by helping people who were not able to purify themselves adequately in this lifetime to have an experience after death where their soul is able to be dry cleaned, purified, repaired, and corrected to the point where it can now move on and exist as a soul in a heavenly, blissful experience in relationship with God.
Rabbi, I'd like to bring up a thought, something that troubled me as a Christian before Messianic time frame for me was that the whole idea of people coming back to me and telling me, well, you know, the reason why you have to do all this stuff is because Jesus hadn't died yet. After he died, then everything changed. And my thought of logic on that is that doesn't make any sense. I mean, for a parent, even though that, you know, some people view him as God, some people view him as the Son of God, getting past all that, if God sent his son per se, to tell us how things are going to be, why would he tell us how to act before he dies, knowing that he's going to die in less than 3 years or a year and a half in some people's views? He's not. He's going to tell you, hey, this is going to happen. I'm going to die. And after I do, this is what you're going to have to focus on. No parent in their right mind is going to limit their instructions for their children. I just thought about me and my children, for example. You know, if they have house rules, and I tell them, David, listen to your mom, pick up your shoes, put your blankets away, clean your room, feed the fish, take out the trash, feed the goats, don't eat the goats, don't eat the chickens, you know, all this stuff around the house, knowing that same weekend we're going on a camping trip in a very dangerous area, and I don't give them any instruction for the trip. And then I send them off with someone else. That doesn't make any logical sense at all.
You're gonna call social services on you.
I told them also to put that 32-foot extension letter away when you're done with it.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We're going to see this as we go on through the Gospels, that you don't really see that anything really changed because the apostles maintained their observance of the Torah. You know, they didn't stop observing the dietary laws or stopped observing Shabbat. They didn't stop going to the temple. We know that, you know, after the death of Jesus, these were still people who were Torah observant, and they were simply hoping that Jesus would return and fulfill you know, the mission of what the Messiah was supposed to do. We're going to see that comes up many times in the New Testament, that what they were expecting was Jesus to just simply fulfill the Old Testament's description of what the Messiah would do, which is to bring redemption to the world in a very real way, world peace and peace for Israel. And, you know, they didn't see that happening, but they were hoping that he would return and do that. But as far as they were concerned, you know, Jesus never taught them that there's a new religion to follow. And they maintained their practice of Judaism. And we know that into the 2nd century, you know, we know that the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, who were the Jewish believers in Jesus, they were also traditional Jews that didn't believe that Jesus was God. They didn't pray to Jesus as God. They didn't stop practicing Judaism. So yeah, I don't think that you know, from at least my reading of the Christian Bible, Jesus was really teaching that everything was going to come to an end now, and everything was going to change.
Right.
Because we don't see that really was what happened. You know, the next passage is really I would call a quagmire. It is really a mess. And
which verse?
There's no way in the world we're going to untangle this. In verse 31, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except in the case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I did quite a bit of research. I read a couple of articles that had been written by very serious evangelical scholars about divorce and remarriage. Some of them were like 50 pages long with incredible analysis.
Rabbi, you're fixing to touch base on probably the one most shady area of the New Testament that I have ever found. Something that when I ask people about it, no one knows what's going on here. They can suggest, but nothing makes sense. So I'm really excited to hear what you got to say about this.
Don't be excited, because as I said, I see it as a quagmire.
Okay.
It is very, very, very difficult area, and I'm not even going to try and unravel it all, because I think that if I was going to do any justice to it, we'd have to spend several weeks, and I don't really see it as that important.
Sure.
But basically, you have two issues here: the issue of divorce and the issue of remarriage after divorce. It's an extremely controversial topic within Christianity and over the history of Christianity. And some have even held, I don't think you find many today, but some have even held that divorce is really never allowed. They quote Malachi chapter 2, verse 16, I think, that God hates divorce. They speak about marriage being a covenant, and covenants are irrevocable. They have a number of passages where, Jesus says, what God has put together, let no man cast asunder. I think it's Matthew 19, and other places in the New Testament. There are many people who basically see divorce as a sin and it's never allowed. Some people say, well, it could be allowed for the sake, maybe this one exception of adultery or sexual immorality or fornication. It's not even clear what some of these terms refer to. Some people read a passage in 1 Corinthians that Paul allows divorce in a case where a believer is married to a non-believer and is deserted by the non-believer. It's just a very difficult area. And, it seems that at least the teachings of Jesus are fairly restrictive. And Jesus seems to either be teaching that divorce is never allowed, or it's only allowed in a case of adultery, which would mean that in cases where the couple is incompatible, they don't like each other, they're not getting along, whatever, it wouldn't be allowed. And that doesn't seem to be the way most Protestant churches today conduct themselves, although I know that there are some who would take a very hard line on divorce. But again, you find basically a range of opinion. And then when it comes to remarriage, and by the way, that's the topic of divorce there, was actually a dispute within Talmudic Judaism, because the Bible in Deuteronomy chapter 24 speaks about divorce because, the woman doesn't find favor in the eyes of her husband because of what the Bible refers to as ervat davar. It's not easy to translate, but some inappropriateness. And the rabbis dispute, what does it actually mean? And so you had a major disagreement between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Shammai actually took a very strict line and said that it's referring to adultery and sexual immorality, and that seems to be, at least according to Shammai, the only legitimate grounds of divorce. And Hillel takes this sort of normal position, which is the accepted position, which is that, look, if for some reason he can't stand his wife, whatever the reason is, he's allowed to divorce her, because he took the view that if a couple is not getting along and they're not living in a loving relationship and they're extremely unhappy, it would be cruel to force them to live together. It would certainly be horrible for their children to have to be living with parents who hate each other and are not getting along and are constantly fighting. So the normal position in Jewish law has always been that even though God does hate divorce, and the rabbis teach that whenever a couple divorces, the altar in the temple even sheds tears. So divorce was always seen as a last resort. It was never something that was taken lightly. It was very rarely done. But in a situation where a couple simply cannot live together, it didn't require that they committed adultery to end the marriage. If they really just hated each other's guts and they were constantly fighting and they just weren't able to live together, that itself could be the grounds for divorce. But the issue of remarriage is certainly problematic, because the Bible in Deuteronomy 24 clearly permits remarriage. What's not allowed is for a woman who's divorced from her husband and then marries another man and then divorces that second man to then go back and marry her first husband. Aside from that restriction, people are free to remarry after divorce. And in the New Testament, it's not so clear. Jesus seems to be saying that except for that one exception, when a marriage was ended because of fornication or adultery or sexual immorality, then people who remarry are committing adultery, he says. So really, for the first 500 years of Christian history, no remarriage was allowed. Today, among Protestants, the majority seem to permit remarriage. I'm not sure how they work it out. I'm sure they have their hermeneutics. And there's a minority in Protestant Christianity today that still forbids remarriage after divorce. But it's a very, very complicated topic, and my head was spinning from all the opinions that I read. So I would prefer not to just spend the rest of our springtime here trying to weave our way through this complicated passage. So let's go on to verse 33.
All right.
Where the gospel writers say that Jesus says, again, you've heard that it was said to our ancestors, you must not break your oath, but you must keep your oaths to the Lord. But I tell you, don't take an oath at all. So Jesus is basically advocating that it's better not to take any oaths. And that's actually exactly what the rabbis taught as well. The rabbis taught that, for example, you should accustom your mouth to never swearing. Another teaching of the rabbis is, right or wrong, don't involve yourself in taking an oath. The reason is very simple. Many times you took an oath and you invoked the name of God, and so to break that oath was, bringing yourself to taking God's name in vain, which was really one of the most serious transgressions. So the rabbi said, look, just don't get involved with making oaths. You don't need it. It's not necessarily a helpful thing to do. It can only land you in trouble. So the cost-benefit analysis was keep away from taking oaths. And actually, it's common practice today among Torah-observant Jews, whenever they make a declaration of an intention to do something, they'll say, bli neder, I'm not making an oath. So even if you're not making an oath, meaning even if you're not saying to someone or to yourself, I'm taking an oath to do or not do X, Y, or Z, even if you're not expressing it as an oath, you're just saying to your friend, I'm going to pick you up, after your class tonight. Many Torah-observant Jews today will still say, after any declaration of intention, bli neder. It means in Hebrew, I'm not taking an oath. I just want to stay that far away from making it even seem like we're taking an oath. So this passage in the Gospels is certainly totally in line with the spirit and the practice of traditional normative Judaism.
Just not that it's new, like it's pretending, like it's suggesting.
Not at all. I mean, this is standard operating procedure. So moving on to verse 38, I believe. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, that was never practiced in Judaism. In Jewish thinking, that was never God's intention, because in the oral Torah itself, the oral Torah that God gave us at Mount Sinai, God said that you don't take out someone's eye if someone takes out your eye.
Right.
And if you break someone's arm, the court doesn't break your arm. There are three problems with this idea of an eye for an eye being taken literally. One problem is that it's totally barbaric. It's a sick, barbaric practice. Number two, it doesn't help the victim. If someone is blinded by an attacker and the court just blinds the attacker, that doesn't help the victim. And number three, our rabbis teach it wouldn't be equitable. Because if you think about it, imagine that there's a opera singer who takes out the eye of a surgeon.
Right.
Or go the other way around, a surgeon who takes out the eye of an opera singer. So the opera singer continues singing opera with one eye, but the surgeon can't practice his practice. He can't do surgery with one eye missing. Or take an example where the attacker had only one eye to begin with. So the attacker takes out someone's eye, but that person can see perfectly well or almost perfectly well with their one remaining eye. But if you take out his one remaining eye, he's totally blind. So the rabbis discuss this and show it's just an incredibly inequitable system to enact an eye for an eye. It's barbaric, doesn't help the victim. So our oral Torah teaches us that what the law is that you pay monetary compensation, damages for any physical harm that you cause. And there are 5 things that you pay for. You pay for the value of the limb. So the court actually will evaluate how much is an eye worth. I don't know how they do that, but they must have some formula for evaluating the worth of a limb. Obviously, an eye will be worth more than someone's earlobe, etc. Taking off someone's entire arm will be worth more than taking off just their pinky. But
Sure.
you pay for the value of the limb that was damaged. You pay for the pain that you inflicted. You pay for the doctor bills incurred. You pay for their loss of income because of their loss of work and loss of their ability to work. And you pay for any embarrassment that was caused by the injury that you caused. So the Torah actually never taught ultimately that we practice an eye for an eye. That's just a non-truth. It was never, ever practiced in Judaism. A good question would be, well, then why did God say that? If the oral Torah says you pay for financial compensation, so why does the written Torah say an eye for an eye? And it could be, I'm going to suggest one reason, that if all that you were told to do is pay, $50,000 or 29,000 drachma or whatever it is, it seems like, in some ways, you deserve to have more happen to you. Meaning that, you blind someone and you're just going to pay them some money.
Right.
So what the text of the Torah might be saying is, look, if you blind someone, if you take out someone's eye, that is so heinous, that is so disgusting and barbaric. On some level, you deserve to have your eye taken out. That's what you deserve morally. At least you should have a feeling that's how horrible your action is. And that's what the written text of the Bible paints for us. It paints for us a very graphic and emotional picture of how disgusting that kind of act is. And on some level, you really deserve that to happen to you. But it wouldn't be fair, and it would be barbaric, and it wouldn't help the victim. And so what the oral Torah teaches is that, practically speaking, we don't take out your eye, we make you pay. So what Jesus says is that you've heard that it was an eye for an eye, but I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. On the contrary, if anyone slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. As for the one who wants to sue you and take away your shirt, let him have your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks of you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So how do we evaluate this teaching of resist not evil and turn the other cheek? Generally, Judaism would find this kind of teaching, if taken literally, to be not wise. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon says in chapter 3, there's a time to kill and a time to heal. There are times when it's appropriate not just to stand there and take it, but there are times when you've got to actually take action. The Talmud teaches in Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin 72a, that if someone rises up to kill you, don't just stand there and let them kill you, rise up and kill them first. If you have to kill someone in self-defense, that's what you do. And we see that in the story of Purim, in the scroll of Esther, the book of Esther. That's what the Jews did. There was this decree by Haman, by Haman, to commit genocide and destroy all the Jews. and the king gave them permission to defend themselves, and that's what they did. They went to war against those that plotted to attack them, and they wiped them out before these people could commit genocide. So turn the other cheek is really not in the spirit of the Torah. It's certainly not wise. I don't know if Jesus himself was truly a pacifist. We see in Luke chapter 22, verse 36, before they come into Jerusalem, he tells his followers that if you don't have a sword, well, then go sell your cloak and buy a sword. I'm not sure he was telling them to buy swords to use as a big butter knife, or to carve up the Paschal lamb.
Right.
So it's not clear to me that Jesus was truly a pacifist that didn't allow for the use of violence at times. Now, there are those who say that there is a source for this idea in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the book of Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 30, where Jeremiah writes there, "Let him offer his cheek to his smiter." So there are those who say that that really is very parallel to what Jesus says here, turn the other cheek, but it really ignores the context of that chapter in Lamentations. The context, as we know, is very important. And what was going on in the book of Lamentations was that the temple had just been destroyed, the Jews were taken into exile, so fighting back against their enemies would have been irrelevant and just ridiculous. It wouldn't be something that you would even talk about at that point. So the context of this chapter of the book, really, of Lamentations, is to give the Jewish people in exile a perspective on their situation of exile and hope in their situation. So Jeremiah speaks really in this chapter of God's mercy and the hope for that. So he writes, for example, in this chapter, "It is good for a man that he bears a yoke in his youth. Let him sit solitary and wait, for he, God, has laid it upon him. Let him put his mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to his smiter. Let him be filled with reproach, for the Lord will not cast him off forever. Though he cause grief," meaning though God causes grief, "he will yet have compassion according to the abundance of his kindness." So what Jeremiah really here is saying is, actually, he goes on at the end of chapter 3 to actually call upon God to punish all of those who afflict Israel. It's not a turn the other cheek philosophy. And it's very clear that in the context of this chapter of offering your cheek to the smiter, it's not in the context of how to confront an enemy, but it's really in the context of how to absorb God's afflictions. Let's just conclude for tonight, if we could. The last piece here in verse 43, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you only greet your brothers, what are you doing out of the ordinary? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect." So here, again, you find this taught very openly in the rabbinic sources, the idea of, not only greeting your brothers. For example, in Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, passage 20, it says, "Heve makdim shalom l'chol adam." You should be the first to greet every human being, right? Be the first to greet them. And actually, the Talmud teaches in Tractate Brachot 17a that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, it says, no man ever gave him a greeting first. No one ever gave him a greeting before he greeted them, not even a heathen in the street. And we have many examples of this. One of the great sages of modern times was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He did live for a while in Toronto, but then he was in New York for many years. And they say that at his funeral in 1986, a number of nuns showed up, and they said that he would take walks in his hometown, and he would pass the nunnery, and he would always say hello and good morning to the nuns, and they felt so honored by him, greeting them so warmly that they came to pay respects at his funeral. This idea that Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, that is nowhere to be found in the entire Hebrew scriptures. There's nothing in the Jewish Bible about hating your enemy. As a matter of fact, in Proverbs chapter 24:17, we're taught, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. You know, we just celebrated the Passover Seders, the evening of the Seder, and one of the practices is when we recite the 10 plagues, we mentioned the 10 plagues that came upon the Egyptians, the practice is to put your finger into your wine goblet and to remove a drop of wine for each of the 10 plagues, because we know from the book of Psalms, chapter 104, verse 15, that wine gladdens the hearts of men. Wine is something that makes us happy. And so our sages said, we cannot be happy when the Egyptians were smitten in the 10 plagues. So for each time we mention one of the plagues, we diminish the wine, which is a source of pleasure. We diminish our joy. And one of the things that we do on Passover is during the middle days of Passover and the last days of Passover, we don't recite an entire Hallel. Hallel, in the book of Psalms, there's a number of Psalms where we praise God and we thank God for his salvations. We don't recite the entire series of these Psalms during the intermediate and last days of Passover, because those were the days in which we were crossing the Red Sea. And in the Talmud, Tractate Megillah, I believe page 10b, we're told that when the sea split and then went back and covered the Egyptians, the angels burst out into song praising God, and God stopped the angels from singing to him, and God said, my creatures are drowning in the sea, and you are singing? So we have a teaching in Judaism that we don't rejoice when our enemies fall. In Proverbs 25:21, it says, if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he's thirsty, give him water to drink. There's no concept that we are to hate our enemies. And Jesus speaks here about praying for those who persecute you. So there's a fascinating piece of Talmud in Tractate Brachot 10a, where there were these terrible hooligans, these lawless men who lived in the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was one of the great sages, and they were causing him a lot of trouble. They were persecuting him. So he prayed for their demise. And his wife, Bruria, who was a brilliant scholar, his wife said to him, how do you justify such a prayer be permitted? Meaning, how can you possibly pray for their demise? And she said, it's written in the Bible, let sins be wiped out. She asked her husband, it doesn't say let sinners be wiped out. It says let sins be wiped out. And so she said to him, since sins will cease, there will be no more wicked men when they discontinue sinning. Rather, she said, we pray for them that they should repent, and then they will be healed. And so we're told that Rabbi Meir prayed for them, and they actually did repent. And that's really the teaching throughout Jewish literature, that we should pray for our enemies to repent. So I think that, I just would say one more thing before we wrap up, if I may. You have here Jesus saying that God sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So to me, it's an example where, Jesus himself acknowledges that there are both righteous and unrighteous people in the world, which is really a contradiction to the teachings of Paul. We see Paul in Romans insists that there are no righteous people in the world, and it's impossible to be righteous. So I'm not sure this is the most important reference point, but I think it's interesting that Jesus at least mentions here that, again, that there are such things as righteous people. Now, next week, we're going to go into Matthew chapter 6, which is really a continuation of the Sermon on the Mount, and I look forward to doing it with you, William.
Well, Rabbi, you always cover and give us such juicy topics to kind of explore into, and it's again, just I'm amazed at the amount of coverage we can pull off in an hour. And I noticed that we cover more when I talk less.
We're going to cover a lot.
We are. Well, we got one final thing we're going to do here. My son is sitting here, and he is going to tell us now. I'm trying to get him to be a little bit braver each time to tell us what this is and what we're fixing to do. Okay, so
numbers.
Okay, talk into the microphone. Say hi. Say hello to Rabbi Skobac first.
Hello.
How you doing there?
Good.
Okay, what are you doing? Go ahead.
Now?
Yeah, now everybody's waiting.
Awkward silence.
Awkward silence. Okay, what is this bowl here? I'll ask you questions. How's that? Okay, what is this bowl here for?
To pick out a number for a winner
Of a brand new car. No.
No.
A chumash. Okay, good. Now, do you remember we're going to do 2 every other week now? Because I really like having Rabbi Skobac pick a number 2. And so if we do 2 every other week, then you pick one, or Sarah, whoever's here, and then Rabbi Skobac gets to pick one. Okay, so I'm going to play my own game. I'm going to let you pick out a number, and then I'm going to predict quietly in my head what number Rabbi Skobac's going to pick. Oh, he's full of surprises though, so he'll probably catch me on this. Okay, wait, you got to finish. Tell him what you're fixing to do.
Let's see. Well, now I want to re-ask questions.
Okay, all right. He wants me to ask questions. Okay, first of all, who are you? Tell him who you are. Introduce yourself. Introduce yourself.
Don't they? Everybody don't.
It doesn't matter. It's formalities. Hi, I'm King David. Yeah.
Hello.
Okay. All right. So basically, what he's going to do, maybe we'll get him warmed up by next time. Everybody knows the protocol. We've got little wooden blocks in here that's actually got numbers written on them. There's no duplicate numbers. I don't know who's posted or picked one on Facebook, but we're doing 2 every other week. So we're still maintaining the 1 week average. So tonight we'll pick 2. David will reach in here. He'll mix them up and he'll grab one out. You can't look at the numbers. You got to look at the camera. So that way you're not picking a number. Okay. And then when he's done, he will show his number and then Rabbi Skobac will pick one. So you people out there have 2 chances. So if one of us is cheating, the other one surely isn't. The other one meaning Rabbi Skobac, because, he would never do that anyway. Okay. David, are you ready? Drum roll. Are you going to pick?
Oh.
All right. Here it goes. What do you smell? Okay, pick a number. Hurry. Okay, hurry. All right. What number you got there, buddy?
2.
Number 2. Flip it around. Make sure it's written on 2 on the other side also. Yep. 2 it is on our end. Okay, wait, Rabbi. Let me think. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to go with 12.
Oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
No.
I did not think that. I covered 2 that I knew it had to be one of these 2, and you picked the one in between. Good job. Number 2 and number 12 are our lucky winners. So if you pick those numbers, and I'm watching timestamps, people. So if you don't go in there now, like Matthew or whoever, and write down something that the tip will be destroyed, 3, whatever. Okay. There's timestamps on Facebook. So no late adding numbers after we picked our numbers. So 2 and 12, send me a message. If you are the winner, send me a private message with the details and we'll go over how to take care of it. Outside of that, Rabbi, it's been a beautiful, beautiful day, and I love having you on the show, and I can't wait till next week.
Thank you so much.
1 week from today, episode number 6. I got it right this time. 7, 6. Man.
7. Next week is 8.
Oh, yeah, there you go. All right.
Fine.
I know. Well, I tell you what, I've just got to slow down. I've got way too much stuff going on, Rabbi. Everybody, we'll talk to you soon. Shalom, shalom, and ultra shalom to you.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.
אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד, איפור